What does a woman do when the one thing she is good at is taken from her because of the shape of her body? Alice Merritt found the schoolhouse padlocked at 7 in the morning, and the lock was brand new. Before the first snow, she had signed her name to a contract selling her into marriage with a stranger. This is the story of Micah Vance, who tore that paper in half in front of the whole town, and of what she did to the men who wrote it. Alice was 23 years old and had taught the children of Kettle Flats, Wyoming Territory, for 4 winters. She could run a column of figures in her head faster than the bank clerk could run one on paper. Nobody in that town had ever thought it worth mentioning. The school board met on a Tuesday and did not invite her. Ida Prewitt carried the decision to the door herself, wearing dark blue taffeta, smiling the entire time she said it. The board had determined that a woman of Alice's size set a poor example to growing children. Ida said the word size the way other people said the word rot. Then she asked, very kindly, whether Alice had ever considered simply eating less. Alice did not answer. She had learned before she was 10 that answering only gave them more to work with. She shut the door and stood behind it until the buggy wheels faded off down the street. There was no family to go to. Her father had died of pneumonia 2 winters back and left her his dictionary, his spectacles, and $11. Her wages had fed her and paid Bess Tolan for a narrow room above the stage station. Now there were no wages. Winter was already grinding down out of the Wind River country, and a woman in that territory with no wages and no kin became a charge upon the county. The county sent its charges to the poor farm at Rawlins. Bess read the advertisement aloud from a Cheyenne newspaper 3 days later, meaning it as a joke. The Galt Land and Emigration Company, matrimonial branch. Respectable women wanted for homestead husbands in the northern counties. Passage paid. Alice wrote the letter that night with her father's spectacles slipping down her nose. She listed her age, her height, her weight, and her weight again, because she wanted it refused honestly rather than refused later. The reply came in 11 days with a printed contract, a stage ticket, and a fee schedule. She read every line twice. Then she signed her own name at the bottom. No one had made her do it, and that was the part she could never forgive. Micah Vance rode into Kettle Flats on the morning of the wedding and tied his horse at the church rail without speaking to anyone. He was a mountain of a man, black hair loose in waves to his shoulders, a jagged scar running from his left cheekbone into his beard. He wore a fringed brown buckskin coat open over a bare chest, gray wool trousers, a brass buckle gone green. 7 years alone on Wolf Gap Bench had left him quiet in a way the town read as savage. Men crossed the street rather than pass him. Lyman Galt came in on the same stage with a leather case under his arm. He was gray-haired and gray-coated, broadcloth brushed to a shine, a black satin cravat at his throat and dark brown eyes that never quite finished looking at a person before they moved on. He walked Alice to the church steps and read the terms aloud so the whole street could hear them. Passage advanced. A husband holding 160 acres, 3 years of residence required, the company fee to be worked off against the land. The town came out for it the way towns come out for a hanging. Ida Prewitt stood at the front of the crowd and said loudly that she had never before heard a woman's price read out in daylight. Several people laughed. Nobody stopped her. Inside, the church smelled of cold pine and lamp oil. Alice walked the aisle in a red linen dress with a white muslin collar and a gray wool shawl, and she could not lift her eyes off the floorboards. Every board had a knot in it. She counted them. The minister opened his book. Galt stepped forward with the contract and laid it open on the rail and produced a pen and turned the pen so the handle faced Micah Vance. Alice looked at that pen and understood exactly what she was. She reached out, took the contract off the rail before anyone could stop her, and pushed it into Micah's enormous hands. "You can still return me," she whispered. "There is a clause on the second page. 14 days, no cause required, and the company refunds you." The church went so quiet she could hear the stove ticking. Galt's smile did not move. Micah looked down at the paper in his hands for the length of 3 long breaths. Then he tore it in half. He put the halves together and tore them again and again, and let the pieces fall onto the church floor between them, like the first flakes of a storm. "No paper," he said. His voice came out low and rough as gravel under a wheel. "If you want out, you say the word and you go, and no company on earth gets paid for it either way." The minister looked at Galt. Galt looked at the shredded contract on the floor. Then the minister cleared his throat and asked Alice Merritt whether she would take this man, and she said yes before she had decided to. Outside afterward, Galt caught her sleeve. "The fee stands regardless of paper," he said pleasantly. "I will see you both at proving up." He tipped his hat to her and got into his buggy and did not look back. Bess Tolan brought the trunk down herself and pressed a folded lap-robe into Alice's arms. "You write to me," Bess said. "You write every stage, and if you stop writing, I will come up there myself." The wagon rolled north out of Kettle Flats at noon. Alice sat on the seat with her hands knotted in her lap and waited for the moment, which always came, when a man looked over and let his face show what he had bought. It did not come that day. It did not come the next. He drove and watched the country and pointed once at a golden eagle working the ridgeline and said nothing else at all for 2 days. The country got harder as they climbed. Sage gave way to lodgepole. The wind came down off the divide with teeth in it, and she was cold in a way she had not known a body could be cold, and she did not complain once. The first night he built the fire, cooked, and handed her the whole of the bedroll. He slept sitting up against a wheel with his rifle across his knees and his coat open to the frost. On the second morning, she noticed the seat. He had folded a thick elk hide across the wagon board before she ever climbed up, because 2 days on bare plank breaks a person's back. He had done it before she arrived, for a woman he had never met. At the creek, he watered the team, filled the cup, and held it out to her first. When she had to be helped down over the wheel, he took her weight without a sound, and his face when she looked up was neutral, observant, almost curious. They came onto Wolf Gap Bench in the late afternoon of the second day. It opened out of the timber all at once, a wide green shelf of hay meadow above a creek, with the mountains standing behind it in a wall of blue stone. A hay derrick stood at the far end of the meadow against the sky, a long lodgepole boom on a pivot with a crank and a sling rope, black against all that light. "That is ours," he said. "That is the whole of it." Then he said, "Mrs. Vance," and it was the first time he had used her name. She had braced herself for a filthy hovel. What she found was a cabin swept to the corners, the chinking fresh, the plank floor scrubbed pale, and a copper kettle hanging polished on its hook. Along the whole north wall stood a shelf of books, 40 of them, maybe more, spines broken from real reading. There was a Shakespeare and a book on grasses, and 2 on veterinary medicine, and a Bible with pressed flowers in it. He gave her the bed. He carried his bedroll into the lean-to off the kitchen and slept there. And when she tried to argue, he said the lean-to had a stovepipe running through it and was warmer, which was a lie, and they both knew it. The cellar held potatoes, turnips, dried apples, and an elk hanging quartered in the cold room. He set food in front of her 3 times a day and never once watched her eat it. She lay awake the first 4 nights waiting for the demand. Every woman she had ever known had told her what a bought wife owed. It did not come. That was somehow harder to bear than if it had. 12 days passed in near silence. She made herself small in the way she had perfected over 23 years, taking the far chair, the back of the room, half a portion. She cooked because cooking was a thing she could do well, and on the 5th night, he ate 2 plates of her elk stew and said, "That is the best food that has been in this house," and went outside quickly, like a man embarrassed. On the 9th day, she found his account book under a tin on the shelf, 4 years of entries, and not one of them squared. She could not help herself. She sat down with a pencil and worked it into columns until midnight. He came in and stood over the table and looked at the ruled pages for a long time without speaking. Then he asked her quietly whether she knew what he had actually been losing on hay freight. She told him. He sat down slowly on the bench. In late October, they drove down to the stage station for salt and mail, and Bess Tolan came out into the yard with her arms already open and her green wool dress flying. The register lay open on the counter where it always lay. Alice signed her name out of habit, and while the ink dried, her eye went back up the page, because her eye always went back up a page. 3 other women's names were written in that register in Lyman Galt's hand, with their own signatures beneath, and Galt's name under each. 1879, 1880, 1881, each of them going north. Bess remembered all 3 of them, a widow from Missouri, a Swedish girl who spoke no English, and a tall woman with a cough. Each had gone up the North Road with Mr. Galt, and not one had ever come back down through the station. Alice copied the 3 names and the 3 dates into her tally book, and did not say why. On the drive home, she watched the road and did the arithmetic she did not want to do. At the cabin, she asked Micah for the plat sheet Galt had given him when the note was drawn. She spread it on the table and set her tally book beside it and lit the second lamp. Every one of those 3 women had gone to a claim marked on that plat. Every one of those claims had been patented inside a year of her arrival. And every patent in the clerk's small, neat hand stood in the name of the Galt Land and Emigration Company. She understood it then the way you understand a sum. A homestead claim needed residence, and a wife made residence look permanent to a land office clerk. A husband who quit could be bought out cheap. A wife who died left no one at all to contest the title. The wives were not brides. The wives were paper. And paper gets burned the day the patent issues. She sat down on the floor by the stove with the plat in her lap, and for the first time since the schoolhouse, she cried, because she had signed her own name to it and mailed it herself. Micah found her there. He read the register names off her tally book, and the color went out of his face, and something else came into it, something that made the lamp flame lean. He took the folded advertisement out of her apron pocket, the one she had carried since Kettle Flats, like a stone she had earned. He put it in the stove and held the door open until it was ash. "You were never bought," he said. "There is no paper on you. There never was, not since the church. You are my wife, because you said yes in a room where you did not have to." He taught her to shoot that November, because he said a woman on this bench who could not shoot was a woman waiting on somebody. By the 3rd week, she could put 5 rounds in a coffee tin at 80 yards. He praised her strength out loud, which no one had ever done. She lifted a hay fork load that 2 men would have split, and he stood watching with something close to reverence and said, Substance survives up here. The thin ones go first. The country takes them in January. They cut the last of the meadow together and stacked it under the derrick. She carried the water barrel up from the creek on her shoulder because it was faster than the yoke, and he laughed out loud for the first time since she had known him. That night, he told her what he had seen at the altar. A woman offering him a door out of his own wedding, he said. He said he had spent 7 years alone and had never once been handed anything that generous. It was snowing when he kissed her by the woodpile, the first flakes catching in that black hair. He put one hand on the side of her face like a man handling something he had been warned was breakable and had just found out was not. Winter closed the pass in December and did not open it until March. She read aloud to him in the evenings, the whole of the Shakespeare and both books on grasses, and he listened with his eyes shut and his boots to the stove. He called her plentiful and meant it as the highest word he had. He said the country had spent 7 years trying to kill him and had never tried harder than the winter she made bearable. He said her body was why she was still alive to be loved. Somewhere in that winter, she stopped making herself small. She took the near chair. She took the full plate. She ate at her own table without apologizing to anyone, and the shame went out of her the way frost goes out of ground. In spring, she laid out the meadow herself, planned the ditch, and set the second cutting a full month later than he ever had. She kept the books. She kept the freight tallies. The place began, quietly, to make money. In May, she posted a letter to the Register of the United States Land Office in Cheyenne, asking for certified copies of 4 patents by section number, and paid the fee out of the egg money without telling anyone. The answer took 6 weeks. It came up on the July stage, and it said in official copperplate exactly what she had already worked out on the floor of her own kitchen by lamplight. Rufus Teague rode up the bench road in August with a folded notice in his hand, green-eyed, in a black wool sack coat and a yellow neck scarf, and a smile that started before he had a reason for it. He looked Alice over from the saddle the way a man prices a heifer and said he had heard Vance got 2 wives for the price of 1. The notice was a demand for payment on the claim note. Mr. Galt would likely want the wagon as well. Micah told him the note was not due until spring. Teague said the note had been assigned, and assignment changed the terms, and if they did not like it, they could take it up in a court that Mr. Galt happened to own a piece of. Alice read the notice through twice on the porch step. The assignment was dated the 9th of September, 1882. 6 days before her wedding. Galt had bought the note on Micah's land before he ever put her on the stage. 2 more riders sat their horses at the gate the whole time, not speaking. When Teague turned to go, he said the proving up date was the 15th, and that a great many things could happen to a man before the 15th. The hay stood cut and stacked by the second week of September, 4 big stacks under the derrick, and the 5th half built. Micah slept in the meadow with the rifle. Alice slept not at all. Galt came in a buggy on the 14th, dressed for town, a lap-robe over his knees, and his gray coat buttoned to the throat. He got down and looked around the bench like a man walking a property he had already bought. He told Alice the school board had done him a considerable favor. He said he preferred them educated. He said an educated woman signs her own name, and a signature freely given is worth 10 a father sells you. Then he told her the rest, because men like that cannot help it. There was coal under the Wolf Gap bench, a seam running 11 feet, and the company was buying. Patented land could be sold to them. Unpatented claims could not. He said he had done it 4 times, and that 4 times had gone smoothly. He said the widow from Missouri had lasted 9 months, and the Swedish girl less. He said it the way another man might discuss a run of weather. The arrangement, he explained, was elegant. Vance would not live to prove up. The widow would not live out the year. A claim with no living claimant reverted, and reverted land was relocated by whichever man had a surveyor on retainer. Alice told him she had written to the register at Cheyenne in May and had the certified copies in the house. She told him she had the station register pages and the dates and the names. She watched his face come apart behind his eyes. He got back in the buggy without another word. Micah put her on the horse an hour later with the register pages sewn into her shawl, and she rode them down to Best-Tolen and put them on the southbound stage herself. She was home by dark on the 14th. The sky over the Wind Rivers had turned the color of a bruise, green and yellow and swollen, and the first hail came down on the roof at 4 in the morning like fists. They came at first light through the hail, 4 riders, and Alice saw them from the cabin door while the ice was still ricocheting off the meadow. Micah was already out at the stacks. A torch went into the 3rd stack, and the wet hay took slowly, and then, all at once, a wall of orange going sideways in the wind. The riders spread out and started shooting into the smoke. Micah put one man off his horse and then went down himself, shot clean through the thigh, and Alice heard him hit the ground from 200 yards away because she had been listening for exactly that sound all night. She ran. She was still running when the derrick boom came down. A rider had cut the guy rope to bring the whole rig over, and 300 pounds of green lodgepole dropped across Micah's chest and pinned him flat in the mud. For one heartbeat, she was every small thing she had ever been told she was. Then the wind changed and drove the smoke across the meadow, and something turned over inside her like a wheel coming off a brake. Teague came around the burning stack laughing. He said something about how there was more of her to shoot at. He was still saying it when she reached the boom. She set her shoulder under that lodgepole, planted both feet in the mud, and stood up. The boom came off Micah's chest a foot, and then 2, and she walked it sideways and dropped it clear. She rolled her husband behind the butt of the wet stack, put his rifle into his hands, and pressed his own bandana down onto the hole in his leg and told him to hold it there and not to argue with her. A rider came around the stack at a run. Alice picked up a full sack of seed oats, 200 pounds, and swung it off her hip into his chest and took him out of the saddle so hard his hat was still in the air when he landed. Teague was at the fallen derrick trying to free his horse from the tangle. The sling rope lay across the mud in a wide, loose loop, and Alice dropped that loop over his shoulders as calmly as if she were hanging wash. Then she got on the crank. She was the strongest person on that bench and had known it since November. And she hauled Rufus Teague 12 feet up into the hail on his own employer's rope. She tied the crank off and left him swinging. The stack fire had jumped the gap, and the wind was carrying it down onto the barn and the horses in it. Alice ran for the water sled, a plank stock tank on runners, 500 gallons standing full for the stock. She got both hands under the skid rail, drove up with her legs, and turned 500 gallons of water over on its side. It went down the slope in one dirty sheet, killed the fire line dead, and put the last 2 riders flat on their backs in the mud with the ice still coming down on them. The 4th man ran for the timber and kept running. Lyman Galt stepped down out of his buggy at the gate with the company's file copy of the contract in his hand, still talking, still explaining what she owed, as though the paper were a weapon and not a receipt. She took it out of his fingers. She walked it 3 steps to the burning stack and held it in the flame until it curled and went black. Then she put Lyman Galt flat on his back in the mud and drove a hay fork through both sleeves of his gray coat into the ground and left him pinned there while she went back to her husband. The neighbors had seen the smoke from 4 miles off and came up the road in a line of wagons through the tail of the storm. The first man over the fence stopped dead at the sight of Teague hanging off the derrick, then went to help her. She tore the petticoat off under her dress, packed the wound, and set a stick in the twist to stop the bleeding, and did not let go of it for 40 minutes while the hail turned to rain. Micah opened his eyes while they were carrying him in. He looked past all of the men holding him at his wife, standing in the ruin of her meadow with mud to her knees and her red hair down. "Valkyrie," he said in that gravel voice, barely above a breath. "Not a woman a man buys. A woman a man is given and spends the rest of his life trying to deserve." Then the hail stopped, and the sun came through the broken cloud onto 400 tons of wet, burnt hay, and Rufus Teague was still turning slowly on the derrick rope when the sheriff finally rode up the bench. Teague talked before they had him off the rope an hour. He gave them the 4 names, the surveyor, the dates, and the standing arrangement, in exchange for a promise the county was probably not entitled to make. In October, Alice Vance took the southbound stage to Cheyenne with the station register pages, the plat sheet, the certified patent copies, the scorched file contract, and her own tally book in a flour sack on her lap. She sat before the register of the United States Land Office for 4 days. She laid the arrival dates against the residence affidavits and the patent dates, and she did the arithmetic out loud in front of 6 men until not one of them would meet her eye. The General Land Office canceled 4 patents for fraud in the establishing of residence. Every acre came off the Gaw Company's books in a single afternoon in a room with a bad stove. The federal indictment came down in the spring on charges of land fraud, subornation of perjury, and conspiracy, and it named the surveyor and 2 clerks along with Lyman Galt. Alice testified for a day and a half. Ida Prewitt sat in the gallery in the same dark blue taffeta and did not once open her mouth, and afterward crossed the street rather than pass her on the walk. Galt got 15 years. He died in his 3rd winter at the Territorial Penitentiary at Laramie of a lung complaint, owing money to the men who had cleaned his cell. Of the 3 women, 1 was found alive in Nebraska under another name and came out to testify. 2 were found in the ground on claims they had legally owned. Their patents were restored to their kin, and the graves got stones with their names cut deep. The coal company came onto Wolf Gap Bench in 1886 and paid the Vances more money in 1 signature than Kettle Flats had seen in its whole existence. They took the money and stayed exactly where they were. Alice built the school with her own funds at the head of the bench road and taught in it herself for 31 years. The board that had padlocked her out had to send its grandchildren to her and ask nicely. They called her the woman who lifted the derrick, and men who had not been within 40 miles of that meadow swore they had watched her do it. The story grew the way stories grow. She never corrected any version of it. The 2 torn halves of the church contract were never found because they had gone into the mud under 100 boots on a wedding day in 1882. And Alice liked that better than a box would have been. They had 3 children on that bench, and the eldest was a girl built exactly like her mother, and no living soul in that county was ever fool enough to say a word about it in her hearing. Micah walked with a limp for the rest of his life and never once let anyone call it an injury. He called it the 15th of September, and he said it the way other men said the name of a saint. On summer evenings, they sat out on the porch with the hay meadow going gold below them, and the derrick standing where it had always stood, rebuilt, and the mountains going blue and then black behind it. She turned to him one of those evenings, 40 years old and unafraid of anything left on this earth, took his scarred face in both her hands, and kissed him the way she had wanted to on the day she was too ashamed to lift her eyes. "You could have returned me," she said against his mouth. He said, "I tore that up." And they sat on together in the last of the light, on the land nobody had been able to take, two people nobody could return.